Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's stay-at-home lecture presentation for November. I'm Tim Nutt, director of the UAMS Historical Research Center, which is the archives division of the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences, the medical school here in Arkansas. And we, as I mentioned, we are the archives. We are the institutional repository for the official records of UAMS. So all the annual reports and things like that that document the history of UAMS, we collect, but we also collect archival materials and artifacts that document the history of the health sciences in Arkansas. And we're the only archives in the state that documents the health sciences history of Arkansas. And I'd like to invite you to have a tour sometime. If you're on campus, sometimes we're located in the UAMS library up on the 5th floor. I'd love to have you come down and show you some of our collections. Today, this lecture is sponsored as usual by the Society for the History of Medicine and Health Professions, which is the support organization for the Historical Research Center. They support us, the Historical Research Center, in a number of ways. Programming such as this. This lecture series was started in March 2020 in response to COVID-19 to give people a way to have access to informative and educational programming during the lockdown. But the Society also provides financial support to purchase materials for the Historical Research Center, and just in sponsoring events such as book signings and other things like that. We'd love to have you as a member of the Society. The URL to join is up on your screen, but if you'd like to just bypass that long URL, you can go directly to paypal.me/shmhp, and you can just do your dues directly from there. The dues are inexpensive, $15 for an individual or $5 for a student, and you can be a student at UAMS, at U of A, in Fayetteville, any of the high schools or colleges, universities in Arkansas or around the country for that matter. So I hope you'll consider joining the Society and helping out the Historical Research Center. As I mentioned, tonight's lecture is part of the stay-at-home lecture series, and it's held the first Thursday of every month from 7 to 8. And next month, we'll finish out the year. I'll be giving the presentation on Dr. Isaac Folsom, who bequeathed some money to the medical school and established the Isaac Folsom Clinic, which was integral in the early part of the 1900s in providing health care to the indigent population of Little Rock and Central Arkansas. Again, that'll be from 7 to 8 as usual, and the link that you use to join tonight's presentation will be the same one that you use to join next month and any other future stay-at-home lecture series presentations that you'd like to join or watch. So I hope to see you here in December, on December 7th, for the program on Dr. Isaac Folsom. Tonight, I'm very pleased to have Kane West with us, Dr. Kane West. He is the educational coordinator at Hot Springs National Park. He is a native son of Arkansas, and he has spent the last decade in the National Park Service, living and working all over the country at a variety of nature and history-themed parks. He earned his Ph.D. in history from the University of South Carolina in 2019. And among his accomplishments is he has published articles in the Journal of the Early Republic and the Journal of Southern History. And he's also received high fives from kindergarten-aged park visitors, which I think is probably the more important accomplishment than having a publication, some days at least. Fortunately, his academic research on settlement in the Arkansas River Valley has kept him tied to his home state. Dr. West joined the staff of the Hot Springs National Park in 2021, finally joining his academic passion with his home state enthusiasm. And tonight he's going to be talking about the Hot Springs treatment, Hot Springs history, hidden legacy, in American medical history. So I am going to stop my screen and I am going to turn it over to Kane. I'm going to mute my audio and stop my video and turn it over to you, Kane.
All right. Thank you, Tim. It's wonderful to be here tonight. Now, normally when I give a program, I try to juice up the crowd, get to know everyone. But fortunately, y'all are all blank screens with your names on them. So I will just assume that there is tremendous visitor feedback because that keeps the excitement going. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So anticipate 10 seconds of technical difficulties. All right. And Tim, if I'm going to keep on going unless you tell me that you can't see my screen.
You're good to go.
Right. Fantastic. So when I accepted the job at Hot Springs National Park, there were three things that were fascinating to me that I really wanted to explore at the nation's oldest unit in the National Park Service. The first one was the history of science and exploration. I wanted to talk about the history of the National Park Service itself. And then I also wanted to explore the history of medical care that's here in Hot Springs. Those three sort of foundational pieces of our story, I think you can't tell the aspects of the Park Service, early American exploration, and medical history in the United States without including Hot Springs. And yet, so often when I read those histories, I don't see where we're located. I don't see how people can connect Hot Springs to those wider national narratives. And so I've always kept in the background this interest in the research components. And so for tonight's lecture, I was very excited to be able to look for how Hot Springs figures into national dialogues about health, about public health, about who should have access to public health. And so the way that this presentation is structured is I'm going to break down the history of Hot Springs over basically the last 200 years into four different pieces. That's going to be the early 19th century, the late 19th century, early 20th, late 20th century. And so the goal being that as we go through each of those sections in time, we will get a global context about what's going on in some aspects of public health, and then a more localized context about what's happening in Hot Springs, sometimes in response to that global movement. And then we'll end up each section in how Hot Springs is actually influencing national medical conversations. My abrupt transition from that introduction is going to be the question of, does anyone know what year Hot Springs National Reservation was established? And I'm going to pretend that I just heard all of you say 1832, because you are all very well versed in the specific history of Hot Springs. And so our first foray into the history of Hot Springs, I'm going to focus specifically between 1832 and 1875, and I can answer about why I put that end date in there, and the emergence of Hot Springs as this sort of rural southwestern spa that is outside of a global movement around mineral spring resorts. And we're gonna back up just a little bit in our time frame before 1832 to talk about Hot Springs. One of the questions that we often get is, what is the indigenous history in Hot Springs? To be perfectly honest, that is a research area that I'm proud to say that some of our colleagues are pursuing with greater enthusiasm right now. But I'm going to throw in two quick quotes that I use as reference pieces to understand, at least during the 1700s, how the Quapaw are using Hot Springs National Park. So the Quapaw living predominantly at the mouth of the Arkansas River where it meets the Mississippi, so southeastern Arkansas. But we have two quotes, one from 1771, the earliest reference that I've definitively found from a Frenchman who says that in the Arkansas country, Western Indians come here to take baths, and they're highly esteemed by native physicians. And so it's very exciting to think of geographical boundaries with the Quapaw, and that being reflected in the use of hot springs itself. And then there is one oral history from a wonderful holder of stories and holder of knowledge from the Quapaw, Ardina Moore, who recorded with us that Hot Springs was the main winter camp for the Quapaw. Now, in that interview, she doesn't say if that's after they're coming back from the plains. Is it that they're coming from the mouth of the Arkansas River to Hot Springs specifically? But these are reference points of people using the mineral springs, the hot springs of Hot Springs, as medical bathing for the Quapaw. Now, zooming out to the more international focus, if you've ever been to Europe, if you're fancy and you're going to Europe in the 1800s, you're probably going to a spa town. You're going to Baden-Baden. You're going to Bath. You're going to Vichy, France. And so what happens in Europe in the late 1800s is that they're going on vacation, if they're fancy. They're going on vacation, and they're also socializing. So that image that you see of Baden-Baden, Germany, you go for health to a German spa, and you stay for relaxation and party and fun games. And then you just get exhausted from your vacation. And so this sort of mixture of health and pleasure at the German spas is going to lead to changes in medical therapies coming out of Europe. And one of the earliest medical therapies coming out of Europe using water and coming to the United States is called hydropathy. And if any of you have friends who like to sit in cold plunge baths today and put it on Instagram, that is not new. That has been happening. It's coming out of Germany in the early 1800s. And the goal is that you are using the medicinal properties of water, sitting in a tub, freezing, coming out shivering, and then convincing all your friends to do it as well because it has medicinal properties. The hydrotherapy, the cold water cure, is going to come into the United States early mid-century. Harriet Beecher Stowe's family members are going to take water cures, and they're going to, again, try to convince their friends to jump in tubs of freezing cold water. And what it's mixing is sort of a natural healing cure with physicians who are training themselves in the purported medical and medicinal properties of cold water, shocking the body, almost restarting it, and really wielding the idea is that if you're a hydropath, that you are wielding the healing power of nature combined with your scientific observation to provide a treatment that isn't like bleeding and purging and the other things that are popular amongst physicians at that time. In the United States, though, what's happening is that in the Northeast, people are saying, okay, let's use water as medicine. And I have two images of very popular spots in the early 1800s that are really building off that European model. One is in Saratoga Springs in New York. The other is the Virginia Hot Springs. And similar to the places in Europe, if you're wealthy, you're traveling to one of these destinations, and it's almost like high society. You're getting out of the city, whether it's Charleston, Richmond, or New York. You're going to the mountains, and you're there for ostensibly you're there for healing, but really you're riding around in your carriage so that somebody can draw a lithograph that can then be used in a presentation approximately 191 years later. But these European-style springs and spas are developing in the Northeast in the United States, early 19th century. And I mentioned that to also say that that is not what's happening in Hot Springs, Arkansas at that time. We have early scientific explorers that are in Hot Springs. The earliest recorded scientific experiments really being done in 1804 by the Hunter and Dunbar expedition. So these are some people from Mississippi who had gone to Hot Springs with the support and approval of Thomas Jefferson. They are going to measure the water. They find that it's 143 degrees. It's the hottest known water measured by European scientific instruments in North America. and it puts hot springs on the map. And so what you see throughout the early 1900s or 1800s is repeat visitors, some of them with scientific expeditions and some of them just there to use the baths medicinally. And one of the quotes that I like from Stephen Long, a famous explorer, is that there are crude cabins that people have constructed over the springs. They're basically creating steam baths and steam houses with just a wooden shack over the springs. This is a far cry from what you're seeing in Europe. But there was a belief in what the springs could provide. And this quote in 1828 talks about it as a regional place for the inhabitants of the Valley of the Mississippi. The idea is that if disease is connected to nature and geography, well, then nature must also provide the healing locations of that disease. And so if you are sick in the lower Mississippi Valley, Arkansas, Louisiana, Tennessee, Mississippi, Missouri, we'll even include Texas in there, even though we know they shouldn't have won in 1969. They are even allowed to come to hot springs. And the hope was that it would become the Saratoga of Louisiana. And yet what we see in this oldest image of hot springs, drawn from an 1834 visit, is that there was just very little development in this place. It's very different from those European spas that we had just seen. There was an attempt in 1832, that medicinal place, that scientific location does get established. And part of the question that we might have from 1832 is, why didn't it develop like those European spas? And I've just put up and then crossed out ideas that had been proposed by the Arkansas legislature to build infrastructure in hot springs. One of them was to lease out the springs and use the money for a medical hospital for the poor. One of them was to actually have a medical superintendent in a hospital. And neither of those things gets approved, and instead hot springs just stays super rural to be able to fit into that southwestern rural entity. And so throughout the early part of the 19th century, if you come into hot springs, you're gonna your choices are sort of an open air spring like we see in the bottom right. There might be a sort of a crude bathhouse that's mixing steam and hot water and wood in a wonderfully rotting out building, or there's just like a fountain coming out of the ground. And so it's a really rough hewn scene when you're in hot springs almost throughout the early part of the 19th century. And much of that bathing is essentially self-prescribed. And so if you're looking for the source of authority for why the hot springs might be medicinally valuable, it's just an individual who comes up to the springs and he says, I think this works for me. I sat under the spout of hot water. It worked. And so hot springs is very different from the Virginia springs or the European springs or the hydropathy. It's basically just people showing up and putting their feet in the water, and they're desperate to feel better from all their pain. The transformation that's going to take place in hot springs in the moving forward is that physicians are going to turn their attention to hot springs, and enterprising capitalists are going to turn their attention to hot springs, and they will try to take this sort of rural southwestern spa town and make it into something that is medically viable and renowned throughout the country. I'm putting years here. In 1876, that's when the railroad shows up in Hot Springs for the first time. And so it's going to transform this largely hard to access place into something that's connected all throughout the country, from New York to Chicago. Now, to put ourselves into a global context, we have now moved into the post-Civil War era. Things that you can do in the post-Civil War era. You can walk over the Brooklyn Bridge because you are very excited about American urbanism. You can go to Coney Island, you can get a hot dog because you're very excited about this massive urbanization in the Northeast. Or you can be very concerned about these cultural changes, and you think that American society, and especially men, are losing their masculinity. They're becoming weaker. And you have one of apparently two ways that you can solve that. First of all, you get born as Teddy Roosevelt and you take really cool photos with your shotgun and you go hunting in the wilds of the American West. That's one place that you can refine your masculine energy in the United States. The other option is that you can become a pugilist because you really like to box. And so we have a rise in American sports in some ways to combat this feeling of men becoming weaker in this changing American society. But what's also happening at this time, in this post-Civil War period, is transformations in medicine. We see with the Journal of the American Medical Association that there, which was actually established in the 1850s, is this growing need for professionalization of the American medical practitioner. But there's also worries about diseases of civilization, things that are making us weak because we're in the city, from mental weakness to the spread of venereal disease to poor lungs, and people are looking for ways to combat this sort of societal and medical transformation. Two of the ways that is thought that we could solve those issues are seen below. One of them is Kellogg's Battle Creek, Michigan Institute. So if any of you like to eat Kellogg's cereal, it's in part a derivation of this huge health center, a sanatorium in Battle Creek, Michigan, that's using ideas from hydropathy and also fitness and obviously diet. The other option is developed by this guy in Germany. His name is Kneipp, and he's reinvigorating water-based cures, but luckily this time it's hot water. And you can see basically what happens is that hilarious German men in the late 1800s will take photos staging all the different ways that Kneipp therapy is supposed to be used using water. And so within that larger social transformation that we talked about urbanization, there's also changes within American medical practice about who you should trust, what diseases are coming into the play, and how we should be able to solve them. As part of this transformation, again, you're supposed to go on vacation to Coney Island, but you could also go on vacation to French Lick, Indiana, home of Larry Bird. On the local scale in Hot Springs, though, there are also new transformations. One of them is that the transformation of the railroad that comes to Hot Springs. There's also several fires that sweep through the city of Hot Springs and basically destroy the infrastructure. And there has been improvements in the federal government's control of the Hot Springs area that is going to allow for the new bath owners to come in and establish more definitive bathhouses. And so Hot Springs in the late 1800s, the medical authority, the legitimacy of Hot Springs as a spa, as a medical place, comes from two sources. The first are the bathhouse owners. And I would be remiss, considering that I know people on this call, to not mention that my great-great-great-grandfather was one of the bath owners of one of the buildings in that upper right-hand corner in the 1880s. So I'm descended from one of those enterprising capitalists who just would confirm to people that their specific bathhouse and their specific spring had specific treatments for specific ailments. And so if you can market it, then you position yourself as the medical authority. The other source of medical legitimacy, the medical authority, the people who could tell you how to heal yourselves, is the rise of Hot Springs physicians. And so they're part of this transformation in American medical care. They're going to start medical journals. For decades, the Hot Springs Medical Journal put out articles from treatment areas in Hot Springs. One of the cool things about being a Hot Springs doctor is, as you see in this photo, you get to sit in a carriage and hold a briefcase and look imposing. But there are discussions about the medical value of Hot Springs water in numerous medical journals that are arising in that late 1800s, and Hot Springs physicians are trying to legitimize themselves within this realm of medical practitioners. And we can even see from one of those titles that syphilis or venereal disease is one of the key diseases that people are supposed to be getting treated for. And by the late 1800s, instead of that self-prescribed sitting in an open air spring, there's a hot springs treatment that is the general process that everyone who comes to hot springs is supposed to experience. And you can see from this quote that patients are usually required to bathe 6 minutes in water 96 to 100 degrees, then 2 minutes in the vapor bathrooms, which is basically just a giant steam room or a steam room where you can have your head out. So you have station 1, which is the bath, station 2, which is the vapor bathroom. And then the best part, personal opinion, is 5 to 20 minutes wrapped in warm blankets. And this process of bathing, vapor cabinet, and warm blankets basically uses hot water in different ways, from its water heat to steam to just water to heat, drawing blood to different parts of the body. Right, so the idea is using water in all of its guises to induce blood flow stimulation. And we actually have images from those bathhouses, from those enterprising capitalists like my great-great-great-grandfather. And you can see in these depictions that hot springs bathhouse process shown on the left. On the right, you see that it's very individualized. You have your own treatment. It's not a large pool. And in the middle, you also get to see that if you're so lucky, you get to also try out the latest and greatest in exercise equipment if you really want to get your back muscles in shape. Those doctors, the bathhouse owners, they also basically wield the power of federal infrastructure. The doctors are making sure that the superintendent of the national park heeds their interests over the interests of people who can't afford the bathhouses, right? Bathhouses, as opposed to open air springs, become the landscape of hot springs. And the federal government is supposed to oversee those bathhouses, but for the most part, it's basically a cabal of bathhouse owners who run the operation at hot springs. There is, however, a government-free bathhouse that is accessible to the medical poor who can't afford a bathhouse. That's sort of the compromise between bathhouse owners and sort of the open access legacy of the early period. And there's also the Army Navy Hospital that is constructed in the 1880s in Hot Springs. It's the oldest permanent all-branch military hospital in the history of the United States. So it is the precursor to Walter Reed Medical Center. And with this new infrastructure, what you're essentially offering is a prompt relief for medical travelers. If you have venereal disease, if you have arthritis, if you have stomach issues, then you can come to Hot Springs from wherever you are. You've probably not been granted medical care or sufficient medical care. You're willing to travel, as we see in this image to the right, perhaps very, very, very long distances just to try to feel relief. I've also thrown in neurasthenia, and if you want to talk to me about that, you can ask me a question later, but it's a sort of a mental health aspect it's caused by basically too much work. So the answer to neurasthenia is stop working, everybody just go on vacation. And Hot Springs also develops specific treatments for syphilis. On the left, what you see is actually a patent for a syphilitic cure in Hot Springs. And on the right, you see a description of what a syphilis patient does in addition to their bath. So the patient takes his bath. We already read about that process. So after breakfast, then goes to the rubbing parlor. And the ununction is basically a drop of mercury put onto a glove. And then as the patient sits on the chair, they just get rubbed for 20 to 25 minutes. And this is going to happen every day after the baths for usually 3 weeks, 4 weeks, up to 6 weeks. And so you're getting rubbed with syphilis, with mercury as a treatment for syphilis, because there are few places in the country that are willing to treat syphilitic patients, right? There's a lot of social animosity connected to having syphilis. So who's going to believe you, or who are you going to want to tell? And so some doctors would say that as many as half of their patients were syphilis patients coming to hot springs. So by the end of the 19th century, hot springs has vastly changed from being a rural southwestern spot, and it is now getting national recognition. It has its access to everyone across the economic scale, from the wealthiest of the wealthy to even people who could not afford to take a bath. And so the government-free bathhouse is sort of this promise of American medical care that the federal government will provide free of cost medical treatment to those who can't afford it. And there are also physicians in hot springs who achieve great national renown. On the right-hand side, this is the Journal of American Medical Association, so JAMA. And this is the chairman's address, so the person who's in charge. And it is by J.T. Jelks, who is a physician in hot springs. And he's talking about syphilis. So you can see that having this sort of national destination for syphilis patients, and that hot springs is the most well-connected place to venereal disease and syphilis patients in the country at a mineral spring resort. And there are physicians who achieve considerable fame because of their participation in that treatment. At the same time, those physicians and those bathhouse owners who had really, really hoped to make themselves the source of legitimacy for hot springs and really push the medicinal value of the springs, that vision doesn't really come to fruition by the late 1800s. And so on the left, you'll see two people debating about the form of treatment at hot springs, specifically about syphilis. And they're going to be using terms that were pretty controversial at the time. And I'll sort of try to break them apart. So on the first one talks about how the springs allow for a heroic treatment. A larger quantity of mercury and iodide can be tolerated. And what that essentially means is that people had known for 1,000 years that mercury was dangerous for you. But for some reason, it seemed as if you were in the hot springs water and drinking the hot springs water, that your body could process and metabolize more mercury than anywhere else. And so you could use mercury and enjoy more of its medical benefits before the poison entered your body, right? So it's this question of how much destructive qualities of your medicine are you willing to handle for the potential positive benefits? And here in hot springs, so it seemed, you could have more mercury, more of that both destructive and potentially beneficial medicine applied to you before it began to hurt you. The response to that below, and heroic medicine is essentially the idea that if you give people medicine in very large quantities and then you see their reaction, like you want your medicine, if you give somebody a pill and it doesn't do anything, then the pill didn't work. But if you give somebody a pill and it makes them throw up, well, then you know your medicine has done something. So therefore it must have worked. And so the response to that belief in heroic treatment is that by the late 1800s, heroic medicine, that overprescribing, was opposed to the latest scientific treatment, and that there was actually therapeutic violence, that you were doing harm as a physician if you use that type of therapy, that it was a step backwards in time. So you're seeing a discussion of hot springs physicians, and they are being lambasted by national physicians for the type of syphilis treatment that's at hot springs, right? This is not the vision of hot springs physicians that they would want to have seen. And then on the right, we see this discussion of, well, is there actually anything in the water? Like, is this water special or is it just hot? And you will see that there are 4 different times, and it's like some of the advocates, others claim, others think, to my mind. And in this paragraph, I've highlighted that some people say it's the specificity of the water. So there's something particular about the water. Some people say that it resides in the electricity of the chemical decomposition. Some people say it's a peculiar heat, different from any other type of heat, which is curative. And then this author thinks, to my mind, it's their heat alone. So it's inconclusive. There's what we see from these arguments is that hot springs doesn't achieve that sort of preeminent location spot among physicians that hot springs is curative. And so this vision of a bathhouse run, physician run hot springs as cure, that vision sort of doesn't fully materialize by the end of the 1800s. But something will change, and hot springs will hit a heyday. And I do work in a building that was built during the Great American Spa period. And if you are a fan of the progressive era and federally subsidized medical reform and federal medical licensing, the heyday of hot springs will emerge, the medical legitimacy will emerge, the medical authority will derive from hot springs not being sort of run by the bathhouse owners and physicians, but being overseen as a federally managed health resort. So having the National Park Service and having the federal government in charge of medical care and overseeing its quality is what will bring hot springs into its greatest influence on the national stage as a medicinal location, a medicinal resort. Before we get into that, again, let's do a big view. Physicians might not like, the doctors might not like what you do with your health, but dang, the people do. The people are going to do what feels good to them. And so there are, even though medicinal waters aren't necessarily fully bought into by all physicians, some, but not all, there's going to be publications like this Mineral Waters of the United States that will detail the temperature and chemical makeup of every single spring in the United States, because by 1900, there are 500 mineral spring resorts in the United States. If you're in the city of New York and you want to solve the problem of poverty and tenement housing, you build public baths. Bathing culture is on the rise in New York. And the only place that outstrips hot springs in terms of visitation is Manitou Springs, Colorado, today in Colorado Springs. But there are, again, 500 mineral spring resorts in the country, and hot springs is certainly one of the two leading ones, along with Manitou Springs in Colorado. Many of you, if you're from Arkansas, you also know this national movement in a local framework. I can almost guarantee you that half of you have been to this location on the left in Eureka Springs. Some of you might be from Siloam Springs. I have no idea. If you are, please yell silently. And also Sulphur Springs in Arkansas, right? So this is just 3 pictures, turn of the century, Arkansas, part of that mineral spring movement. But none of those places are quite like hot springs, because hot springs is going to become a federally managed health resort. When you become a federally managed health resort, you get to have your own Uncle Sam poster telling you that we need you to come bathe the world at Hot Springs National Park. We have postcards that are proud to say that this mineral spring spa resort is owned by the federal government and under its direct supervision. Hot diggity dang, the progressive era must have been wild for people who are government bureaucrats. So Hot Springs, instead of being a medicinal resort sort of run by physicians and bathhouse owners, it becomes a medical place run by a medical man who has been hired by the federal government. And so starting in 1903, you will have a federal licensing board that anyone who, and we'll talk a little bit about that, there's going to be superintendents who are themselves physicians for about a 20-year period. So there's always a medical mind who is hired by the federal government to operate and manage the springs. If you're going to be a bath attendant or in hot springs, you are required to take training. If you're going to be a masseuse, you're required to have national certifications. If you're a bathhouse owner, you can't have some rickety structure that is dilapidating and decaying. You need to have the latest in water-based therapy equipment, and you need to have a really cool bathhouse. There's also going to be spot inspections. So imagine the superintendent of Hot Springs National Park coming by, a la the person on the right, and measuring the temperature of your water unexpectedly. And the reason that this matters is that Annie Oakley once took a bath in Hot Springs because she would come here after in the off season, and she was left in a very hot, probably a vapor cabinet, too long, and she fainted. And so we can't have Annie Oakley fainting in Hot Springs. So we need to have inspections. And what's most interesting in terms of what Tim was talking about earlier for research is that Hot Springs is going to promote specific medical research with the waters. And so we will see a transformation in how Hot Springs is run now that it is, instead of essentially being in private hands, it is a federally managed site giving medical authority. If you want to be a physician in Hot Springs, you have to be federally licensed. In the middle, you see a list of the people who had been approved that month. And that list would be updated monthly. It would be posted in the front of every bathhouse so that you weren't getting your medical care from somebody who was just trying to sell you on something. The picture to the right, one part of it is a picture of the Arlington Hotel in downtown Hot Springs. The other part is the Medical Sciences Building in downtown Hot Springs. And so the physicians who are operating in the Medical Science Building are private physicians, but they've ostensibly been approved by the federal government. And then on the left, what you see is a prescription of how hot a bath should be, how long somebody should be in there, and how much water they should be drinking while they're inside. So it's you're getting medical care, but you can be guaranteed of its quality because the feds said approved that physician. You're also, because of this new federal management, going to nicer bathhouses. By the time of these reforms, my great-great-great-grandfather is no longer with us, but his wife is, and she's one of the bathhouse owners, and she gets a reprimand letter, and for almost 2 or 3 weeks, her bathhouse is shut down because she's not up to snuff, and then she gets it up to snuff, and so here I am. We have the Fordyce Bathhouse, where I work today, the promenade with the Quapaw Bathhouse, and then I threw in for good measure a new and updated Army-Navy hospital, basically twice the size of the original. Looks like my alma mater, Central High School, because Hot Springs is a jewel of Art Deco buildings that are medical buildings. All thanks to the federal government requiring leases to upgrade their bathhouses. And man, are those places fancy. This is my HGTV interlude. Look at the inside. We have a Hubbard tub in the Fordyce that if you look up hydrotherapy or Hubbard tubs on Wikipedia, this Hubbard tub is the photo. It's Wikipedia approved. You're going to have sort of socializing spaces in these bathhouses where you're supposed to listen to music, sit in wicker chairs, have really cool hats. And the interior of these bathhouses is extremely exquisite, especially in the Fordyce. Marble, hand-laid tile, the best statuary, beautiful stained glass. These are sort of monuments to this entire movement of health and wellness at that time. And to be perfectly honest, the experience that you're having as a bather, we've improved the interiors and we've added a few treatments, but it's basically the same that it had been in the late 1800s. You're still sitting in a tub, drinking the water, sitting in the vapor, and then getting wrapped in a towel. So it's still the heat of water, the water internally consumed, the vapor, the heat and vapor, and then using heated towels to direct blood flow to certain parts of the body. So in reality, even with this federal management, the treatment hasn't actually changed, but the presentation of it certainly has. And so that's where we have all of these marketing photos of how comfortable it is to be scrubbed while you're in the bathtub, to hang out with your friends in the the pack room with the hot towels, to sit under what I presume is the most comfortable shower in the world, a needle shower, which is 360 degrees of warm water to draw blood throughout the entirety of your body. But again, it's not really that different. It just has a nicer veneer with the upgraded bathhouses and the federal management. And if you're a bathhouse owner, you lean into that federal management like it's crazy. And so what we're looking at with these photos is new and improved hot springs, early 1800s or early 1900s. I mean, when you come to hot springs, who wouldn't want to take photos with elk? Who wouldn't want to go to the Arlington Hotel? But in these same presentations is that, the one in the middle, this is set apart by the nation, by the federal government, for the health and pleasure of the people. Hot Springs is a health and leisure resort managed by the federal government. That's what gives it its legitimacy. Or we see a magazine article that it is the United States government reservation, and it's the world's greatest health resort. And in fact, Hot Springs in 1916, at the opening of the National Park Service, is the most visited national park by a country mile. A third of all visitors to the National Park Service are coming to Hot Springs. And to accommodate all of that visitation, Hot Springs has approximately 500 hotels and boarding houses at the turn of the 20th century. That is 500 hotels and boarding houses, equivalent only to New York City. So we are one of the most accommodating cities in the United States because everybody loves to come to Hot Springs. That's going to be military members like we see above. It is going to be businessmen like we see in this cartoon on the bottom left. After 21 days at Hot Springs National Park, you can throw away your crutches and apparently look very dapper as your back is stretched high and you're feeling good. And the clientele is also across racial lines. So this group to the right is a group from Georgia, including Booker T. Washington's wife. And a portion of Hot Springs, though segregated, begins to accommodate and have bathhouses for the wealthiest of African Americans as well. And so Hot Springs is this very bizarre, interesting southern city with a tremendous pool for people across the racial and economic spectrums. And it is all constantly recognized as having a federal overlay. And then the last aspect of that federal overlay here in Hot Springs is that if we're going to tell you that the hot springs are curative, well, we have to be able to produce research on it. And so what you see on your screen are 3 examples of federally subsidized research. I'll go right to left. Haywood comes in, he measures all the springs, he puts the numbers on them. We still use his numbers today, but that was obviously submitted to Congress to get a chemical composition of the waters. In the middle is one of the medical directors. He reached out to every single mineral water researcher that he knew across the country. And so it's basically 200 pages of people sort of proposing research problems or research possibilities to the medical director. And the last one is a transformative piece of research for Hot Springs conducted in 1904, which is on the radioactive properties of hot springs. And so Hot Springs was noted to be radioactive to a marked degree. And that research gets repeated in the New York Medical Journal. And in fact, Hot Springs as this medical place, oh, I didn't mean to put that very cool thing in. Hot Springs as a medical research location becomes a model for the whole country. Radium magazine, would never be published today, I don't think, talks about the radioactivity of hot springs as the source of the healing properties. And the research into the hot springs water gets highlighted by Simon Baruch, who says that this hot springs reservation is a scientific health resort that should become the model for Saratoga, New York. So we're 100 years after Hot Springs was supposed to be the Saratoga of Louisiana, and today Saratoga, well, in 1912, Saratoga was supposed to become modeled after Hot Springs. And in fact, Saratoga Springs, national parks use the Hot Springs government-managed medical resort model. And so Hot Springs, we're not Yellowstone. That is not who we are. But there are certainly state-managed and federally managed sites that use Hot Springs as the mineral spring influence. And in fact, the Public Health Service research into syphilis is coming out of Hot Springs with the United States Public Health Service. Again, we're looking at the Army Navy Hospital, the federal military hospitals in San Francisco at the Presidio and at Walter Reed. They are basing themselves as these federally managed health institutions with Hot Springs as one of the leading research institutions. We can't tell the history of American public health institutions without including Hot Springs National Park. You just can't do it. And so the influence of federally managed places, federally managed public health, Hot Springs is at the center of that. And then it all changes by the late 1940s, right after World War II, so that people like me get to walk around in these cool buildings in our hats. We know the story of Warm Springs, Georgia. Here we have FDR, but Warm Springs, Georgia is actually an example of places that had been on the fritz. So he actually revives it in the 1920s, but Warm Springs, Georgia, that medical model, it had started to sort of decline until he arrived in the 1920s to bring a higher profile to it. But the thing that, so Warm Springs, Georgia, falling, sort of losing its cachet in the early 1900s, is a better example of a medical resort in the country than Hot Springs, because Hot Springs stays popular. But what really knocks us down is post-World War II medical advances, specifically penicillin, which is going to be able to address many of the infectious diseases, and then this belief in scientific medicine, this miracle cures to transform the United States. And I show a cartoon here of Captain America, that the serum, like the culture believes in the serum that can solve our ills. And Hot Springs, which had been able to survive fires, floods, World War I, the Depression, you see that after 1947, it goes on basically a continuous decline in baths that stretches into today. And so that post-World War II period with the rise of penicillin and other pharmaceutical medicines marks the end of Hot Springs. Our buildings close from 53 to 62 are the first sort of like decade of closures, from the public bathhouse to the federal military hospital to the Fordyce, where I work. And so today we're left just with stories. What we research, we actually have a research project onto the people who are bath attendants, but that place where it had been active medical care is now a place where we try to capture the stories of the past. And so we sit in a park that once was a place of the present, providing medical care for the people, becoming a federal model, and today we just give tours. So thank you all for listening to my talk, and we should have a few moments for presentations.
We do. Thank you very much, Kane. That was interesting, and I learned a lot about Hot Springs that I didn't know. We do have some time for some questions. If you would like to type them into the chat feature, Kane will be happy to answer them, I'm sure. While we're waiting on people to type, I'm curious, you mentioned the health service, and in the late I guess beginning in the late 1890s and the early 1900s, the government did have or the health service did have a VD clinic in Hot Springs with O.C. Winger as the superintendent of that. Did the health service work in sort of hand in hand with the Park Service?
In 1921, they opened the new government-free bathhouse. They needed more space because the free bathhouse was actually the most visited by far. And one of the floors was the public health service clinic on the top floor, and the government-free bathhouse was on the bottom floor.
Okay. We have a question. Was polio a factor in the decline?
Tricky question. The Park Service, the bathhouse owners wanted to have more polio-specific treatments. The Park Service did not want to be directly associated with polio. They don't give a clear reason why. And I just see those in a few letters. And so we had some ways of healing polio addressing polio in the park, usually aquatic aqua therapy and the Hubbard tub. But it was that vaccine comes out a decade after the decline already begins.
I remember as a kid, we would go over and we would take our milk jugs and fill them up with the water from the fountains and then bring them back, and then we would of course have them and drink them later. Are there is there any sort of difference, or has there been any research about whether you ingest the water by drinking it or taking a bath in it? Is there a difference?
It was supposed to be both. It was external consumption and internal consumption. And so you're using the heat of the body externally, and then you're just purifying yourself internally.
Mm-hmm. And I imagine there's still people who bring their bottles to Hot Springs and fill them up.
Yes, they are a great attraction to the tourists who like to take photos of them.
So how were you aware of the sort of the medicinal or the medicine side of Hot Springs before you started working at the park?
Not really. I looked at Hot Springs in my own research as state intervention in the territorial period in Arkansas. How do you get federal intervention on the rural southwest of the United States? You say, hey, we have this medical place. Will you please invest in it? But I hadn't looked into the development of medical care at Hot Springs. And I think that blindness is indicative of what's happening for a lot of people in Arkansas, is that we have no idea how central Hot Springs was to medical travel in the United States for about a 50-year period.
If someone wanted to learn more about the history of Hot Springs and the waters, do you have, I know there's not a recent book written about the history of Hot Springs and the waters, but are you familiar enough with the bibliography of Hot Springs that you can maybe give some recommendations for people to read?
Sure. So the Administrative History of Hot Springs is online. It's a National Park Service publication. Elliot Bowen wrote a book recently. It's probably our best book that we have in the park. There are a few master's degrees that are recent master's degrees that are about different aspects of Hot Springs as a medical location. Most of them are sort of judgy about the reputed medical quality of the water. So you're really getting a social history of the medical care, similar to what I just presented.
Mm-hmm. We had, and I will mention that we had Dr. Bowen, Elliot Bowen, give a presentation. And so his presentation is actually recorded just like this one is being, and it's uploaded on the YouTube site. So you could rewatch this one again, and then you could go watch Dr. Bowen's talk. We have a couple of questions in the chat. First one, to what extent were houses of ill repute part of the Hot Springs picture?
Yes. One of the reasons that there is transformation in the U.S. Public Health Service is that there were concerns that people who were coming to get free government-funded venereal disease treatment couldn't afford that venereal disease treatment, and so were working on the side at night in those houses of ill repute while getting treatment for venereal disease during the day. And that led to research studies that said that part of the issue with venereal disease was economic status. And so, yes, the people who came to Hot Springs were certainly at the bathhouses, and that probably did not help their venereal disease cases.
We have another question from a student at the U of A in Fayetteville. She has been working on research on the black bathhouses and have found some interesting information. Have you come across any interesting advertising for those, similar to the one you showed about Uncle Sam?
Not yet. And if you find it, please let us know after you publish your research. I think that that's an area that we're going to get better. The story is sitting there, as you can already tell. So I have not found a similar advertisement like that yet.
I imagine those are fairly rare, or pretty rare, actually.
We haven't looked in the right magazines. The magazines are there. Ebony Magazine has huge profiles on hot springs all the time.
Okay, I wasn't aware of that. Another question was access to health care for all, regardless of income or race, like in Hot Springs, replicated anywhere else?
I have not seen. There are other federally influenced sites, but you don't see that specific institutional emphasis, or I have not seen that specific institutional emphasis anywhere else. Not that it doesn't exist, but Hot Springs is the leading example of a mineral medical resort, and so the intentionality is there that I haven't seen elsewhere.
And then we have a question regarding the black bathhouses. What is known about the black physicians in the Hot Springs medical community?
Sure. So that list that I showed you from 1912, it has several colored doctors. It's listed. There were attempts beginning in the late 1880s to have black-owned bathhouses. The earliest one that we know of is from 1891, closes the next year. And there's tremendous consternation among growing black bathhouse, black visitors. And so in the early 1900s, circa like 1905, 1906, you'll start to see the actual development of the black-owned bathhouses. And there is a building on Malvern Avenue, off Park, that is called the Woodman of the Union Building, the National Baptist Hotel. And it was described by a gentleman from Washington, D.C., who was selling books for Carter G. Woodson, the father of Black history. This bookseller in Hot Springs described the Woodman of the Union Building as the most impressive building owned by a black man in America. And a place you can go get a little bit of a sense of the fraternal organizations that own that would be at Mosaic Templars in downtown Little Rock.
Well, thank you all for being here. Appreciate you, Kane, for being here and for your presentation. Really interesting. I will remind everyone that this has been recorded. It will be, after some editing, and we added our title slides and all that, it will be uploaded to the YouTube channel, and I'll send out an email to those who were here tonight and to our folks on our distribution list, letting you know that it is uploaded. And Kane, I'm assuming that if people want to get in touch with you, they can just email you at the Park Service, correct?
Correct. It's Kane_West@nps.gov.
Okay. Well, thank you again for being here. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for being here, and hope to see you next month, December 7th, as we finish out this year for this lecture series. And everyone stay safe. Kane, thank you again, and we'll see you soon.
Appreciate it. Have a good night.